Welcome to episode 2 on ancient Greece, the polis. A polis is, in its simplest form, a city-state. City-state is characterized by a city and the surrounding land with its own government. There was no set or standard size to a city-state. It just covered as much territory as possible, as far as the city's army could protect, as far as the city's tax collectors could collect taxes, as far as the resources of a single city could reach to improve the lives and land of its people. As we get into the Roman era, you'll see city-states eventually expanded into kingdoms that might control multiple important cities. They eventually grew into empires that ruled multiple different kingdoms. And it isn't until the last few hundred years that you'll see the emergence of modern nation states, such as Europe and the United States. But back to city-states. You can think of city-states as like tiny independent countries. That's the kind of political institution that dominated the ancient world. And the polis is a very special kind of city-state, hence the special term. It applies only to ancient Greece. As you can see here, colored in red, they came into development about 2,500 to 2,800 years ago during the Archaic era, and lasted until the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. Speaking of Alexander the Great, here's an ancient bust of him on the left and a mosaic on the right. He only lived for about 32 years, but managed to make the largest empire in history up to that time, and his empire spread the culture of Greece across Europe and Asia. The life and death of Alexander the Great mark a major turning point in the ancient history of Western civilization. So remember the year 323 BCE. Anyhow, enough with Alexander the Great for now. Here are a few points about the Greek polis. A polis was more than a collection of buildings. It was the citizens, their laws, and their traditions, their very culture. It was said that if you moved all the people from one location to another, the polis traveled with them. What was left behind would only be empty buildings. None of the ancient city-states that came before this had the concept of citizens. They had rulers and subjects. Though they had similar layouts and cultural beliefs, no two polis are exactly alike. They had their own main gods or goddesses and specific values and traditions to each individual polis. Hundreds existed, but we only know details of a few. We'll mostly look at Athens and Sparta. As far as sources about the polis go, one of the very oldest written ones is about the first Olympic Games in 776 BCE. This date isn't one you'll need to memorize, and it probably isn't exactly right anyways. So, around 776 BCE, the first Olympic Games were held. And yes, our modern Olympic Games are modeled after those of the Greeks almost 2,800 years ago. We know that all Hellenes were invited, and this brings me to an important point. They didn't call themselves Greek. We call them Greek because the Romans called them Greek. They called themselves Hellene. Several polis are named in these old sources, and we know the teams were based on an individual's polis. So we know there must have been a sense of community and loyalty in each polis, as well as a greater sense of community as a Hellene. So even though each polis competed against the other polis, they still considered Hellenes as a distinct people and not part of a greater Persia or Egypt or whatever. Here's another historical reference to the concept of polis. Not houses finely roofed, or the stones of walls well built. Nay, nor canals and dockyards make the city, but men able to use their opportunity. Now, this is a concept that you find only in the ancient Greek city-states at this point. Men that are able to build themselves into better people, versus in Persia, where you mainly have citizens that are supposed to be loyal to the king. Now, I've tried to emphasize that each polis was different and essentially an independent country, but they also had some features in common. So here's a map of Athens, and it has the typical features that you find in every polis throughout Greece. In the countryside, you have small farms. The farmers would be the hoplites, so soldiers I talked about in the last video. And so you need a lot of farmers to have a lot of hoplites to protect your polis. They created the food supply, they'd have their own sanctuaries, but overall this limit of farmland was limited by natural barriers. It'd go up to the sea or up to a mountain, and that was it. There were always public water supplies found within each polis. There'd be fountains and springs and cisterns, and they'd actually put quite a bit of effort into making sure there was a functioning water supply for all citizens. At some high point within the city, there would be what's called an Acropolis. Now, the Acropolis of Athens is especially steep and especially high. Some of them are just the highest point, maybe 20 or 30 feet above the rest of the city. But it is where they would have a defense point. where our people, especially in the early days of the Polis, would go to defend themselves if any kind of raid or invasion came in, because that is typically the part where they defended to the last man, where they'd find their victory. This is where people would typically build altars to the gods that they thought were essential to those victories. So at the top of an acropolis, you typically found temples and altars and public monuments. Down in the main part of the agora, and this is where people spend most of their time, is in the agora. You'd have the public square, the market. You'd have shops for people selling food, selling clothing, and talking about politics. You wouldn't find that discussion of politics in most city-states because most citizens were not allowed to be part of the political system in city-states. In Greece, they were. And so there would be a great amount of political discussion within the agoras. And then by the 5th century BCE, typically they were surrounded by walls. Within the Acropolis and Agora would be dedications to many gods, but each city had its own chief patron god or goddess. Here we have listed a few. Most people are aware of Athens and Athena, and Olympia and Zeus shouldn't be a surprise. But then there's Sparta. They were the only polis with a permanent army. Every male citizen had to be a trained warrior, ready to die in battle. So who would be their patron? Athena, of course. Spartan soldiers were expected to be smart as well as brave. If you expected me to say Ares, then you know he's the god of war, but more specifically, he brought chaos and bloodlust to the battlefield. The Spartans were more interested in victory on the battlefield, which is why they venerated Athena. Now on to colonization. If the polis and Greek culture had been limited to just a few city-states, we probably wouldn't be looking at it today. However, Greece is very mountainous and surrounded by water, so there's only so much physical room for a polis to expand to. When they ran out of room, they created colonies. The poor, the hungry, or the adventurous would pack up and move across the Mediterranean and create a new polis. The effect was the culture, politics, economics, and technology of the Greeks were spread all over the Mediterranean world. While the new polis was completely independent from the old one, they usually maintained good relations and traded with one another. That meant as one polis gained an advancement, whether it be in philosophy, art, architecture, or technology, that advancement spread to other Greek city-states. Since communities generally embraced advancements, aspects of the Greek culture came to be a common thread found all throughout this part of the world. That said, there was still a distinctive Egyptian culture and Persian culture, but their technologies and ideas did overlap. You could read this slide on your own, but keep in mind that last bullet point here. Greek colonies in Italy influenced Roman culture, which continued Greek traditions. This is why you need to learn about Greek culture and traditions. So let's look at what the Greeks wrote about their own culture by watching a video. Maybe you've heard of the ancient Greek epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're probably based on true events from the Mycenaean era. They weren't written down until the Archaic era. The people and lessons described in these epics were almost sacred to the Greeks. And they didn't have a Bible, but this is about as close as it got. This scene is from the Iliad. The two characters here are Achilles, played by Brad Pitt, and Hector, played by Eric Bana. At the start of the scene, Achilles rode to the enemy's gate and challenged Hector, a prince of Troy, to single combat. Everyone knows that Achilles is most likely to win the fight, but for Hector to refuse would be shameful. Hector's duty is to answer the challenge, even if it will likely cost him his life. So they fight while Hector's family watches. Now go ahead and watch this video and then come back to this one. So why do we watch that? As I said before, the Iliad and Odyssey were practically sacred to the Greeks. They all knew these characters and were expected to follow the lessons of their lives. These two people from that scene demonstrated extraordinary fighting skills and bravery. The Greek word to describe this is arete. See it there in bold? That's a vocab word to remember. Arete. This is a key aspect of Greek culture. A person that demonstrates true arete needs to be the best at something that is traditionally manly. Sorry, ladies. And they have to be recognized by the community for it. You could be recognized for arete based on physical or mental skills. But again, people need to notice. I'm going to look a little ahead here, but another big influence on Western culture is Christianity, which encourages modesty and humility in putting others first. The Greeks, on the other hand, were kind of the opposite. They were more concerned about their place in society and making sure other people knew it. We have aspects of both the Greeks and Christianity in our culture in America today. Think about the social value our culture gives to people who excel at physically and mentally taxing feats. War heroes, athletes, cowboys. We don't use the word arete anymore, but you could sure recognize where we'd find it in our society. Okay, that's enough stuff for one video. Next time we'll look at the armies, the governments of ancient Greece, and then we'll look at two polis in particular, Sparta and Athens.